Everyone. Um, this is Marina Tabassum. I am at the moment sitting in my office in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So, greetings from Dhaka. So, I will take you now more to the mature delta in a way. And this mature delta, this map is actually from the south of Bangladesh. You can see this is the Sundarban area, and that's the Bay of Bengal. Quite beautiful, very almost like a painting. And close to this, this is our site for the Panigram Resort. And the reason I'm showing you all these projects, it's in a way also my investigation into looking into land to find the ingredients, to find the mother tongue of what my architecture should be in a way. So this is also another project which helps me with that whole situation. So that site that I showed you in Google Map is actually this location. And you can see how beautifully green the entire landscape is. It's very agricultural land, very fertile. We get 3 crops a year, so it's a very fertile land. And most of the vegetables of Bangladesh is grown around this area. And it's quite beautifully green. And that's the site from the river, and the river that goes next to it is Kopotakko, and that's our site over there. It's a very scenic, very flat land, very delta landscape. And this is the Kopotakko, and this is the image from when you stand on the site, you see the river. And so you have paddy fields, mustard plantations during the winter season. So the seasonal changes are quite beautiful and varied, so the landscape doesn't remain the same all through the year. And life is still very simple, very quiet, still very much in a symbiotic relationship with nature. So, I mean, the whole technology hasn't really touched the villages yet. So this is still quite a beautiful virgin land in a way. So when we went to the site, we looked at it, and then the dilemma was, how do you build anything here? I mean, we totally understand the client wants to have a business investment, but then what do you build? How do you build in a location like this? So that kind of brought us so this is what I wrote during my visit, that it feels like a crime to invade the silence with the roaring noise of architecture. So that's when I decided that I need to understand the land, to make an investigation into how people build, and to, in a way, look into the wisdom that exists in the land. So what we tried to do is we looked into how people build. So this is how actually people build in the villages. So when there is a construction or an act of building that takes place, people generally dig a pond. And when you dig a pond, you take the extra earth out and you create a mound. And on the mound, you basically place your houses. And so this is a very generic section that you see where a flat land is then turned into a landscaped space where you have a small water body and then a mound of houses. So in plan, it looks quite similar to this. Or let's say this is a household and it's their pond. So this dug out earth is created into a mound, and these are the houses that is placed on it. So we tried to understand that this is how people generally build in the delta, because earth is the only material that they have. So they take earth and then make mud houses and using thatch as their roofing. So this is a very simple way of building. And if you look at a house, basically these are this is, let's say, a program of a house. These are the different elements that actually constitutes a household. And this is basically a plan, single plan, where you see a courtyard and all the household items that I just showed you of a program are just placed surrounding a courtyard. And these are not distinctly defined courtyard, but these are courtyards which are connected from one with the other. So every household is connected. So there's a very unique social and communal connectivity among the neighbors. So that's how people generally live. And that's how the entire village is actually built. So this is a potter's village. You can see all the potters' villages, the courtyards, and how they are quite beautifully connected to each other. And this is one of the potters' family. So we basically went and surveyed all these villages that are surrounding the site to have an understanding of the place and how people build. This is the weavers' village, and that's how one of the weavers' families. And the other very unique thing that we found, especially mostly through history, is that there is this very unique roof form that you see, especially in Bangladesh, where this is called the Bangla roof. And the Bangla roof is quite unique because it's a pitch roof, which is also a faulted form. And the reason for it is obviously the construction system, but more than that, what it does is it doesn't let water stay on it, since it's a very monsoon-based region, and it's a very fragile material. It immediately takes out the water. So basically that roof form is quite unique of Bengal Delta. And if you see, this was also copied by the Mughals, and in some of our old temples, this is also what you see. And so this form of roof you don't see anymore. It's not there. It's completely, it has completely lost. We don't have that anymore. You don't see them. So one idea was, how can we revive that? And since it's a resort, there is always a possibility of revival with this kind of projects. So that was one of the ideas. And these are the textures that you find around that area. So these are the ingredients we kind of looked into. And then this is our site, our access route, and how we wanted to bring people into the site. So we did a master plan, basically. That's our master plan. As you can see, this used to be my original one when I was starting to discussion with the client. But then once we did our study, it changed to be something very different, much more embracing the local construction system and local way of living and creating a village-like atmosphere. So these are the different bungalows we made plans of. The construction system that we employed was, so you can see there, this courtyard, so you can go from one house to the other. So that's something we did. And these are mud construction, so we made mud walls, very thick mud walls with thatch roof. The other thing what we did is, since we were becoming very close to the local villagers due to our constant connection with them, understanding their construction system, their lifestyle and everything, we decided to include them into the entire process of construction. And so we especially went to these younger people, especially the younger generation who, after studying in the villages, goes off to the city looking for a job. We kind of tried to keep them in their own land. So we gave them opportunities, we engaged them into the project. And in many ways, they don't know the old skills that their grandparents would know. So one way was to kind of get them engaged so that they also become more involved and understand the skills. Though they don't know how to make it, at least they will have an appreciation of it. So to, in a way, generate a pride of the place. So pride of the place is also something important, as wisdom of the place is. So that these are the things we try to work on. And in terms of construction, as we engage the villagers, we also used sun-dried mud brick from a local place. So these are sun-dried mud brick, mud mortar, and then we have wooden frame structure, wooden roof structure, basically. Rafters or purlins are with wood, and thatching. And this is a very unique thatching, as I was mentioning, that we use Bangla roof form in many ways, trying to improvise that in some places, but using the same thatch that you would find in these areas. This is an interesting palm leaf which you can find in the Sundarbans, and only a very certain time that the government would allow you to cut it, because then it's too much or plenty right after the monsoon. So we acquired those palm leaf, and then we kept it and we used it in the project. And there are only 2 teams in Bangladesh at the moment who knows the skill of making this thatching. So that's also, again, another kind of revival. And women do the best plastering. So there's a lot of women working in the site, doing plasters and many other works. So these are the ladies resting after the day's work, actually. So that's one of the bungalows. And from the river, this is what you see. So in a way, as an architect, would you call this architecture? But in many ways, at times, it's not about the buildings that you build, but the process that you build. So we try to create an interesting process. We try to design the process, whereby with that process, you come to a design where you engage people, you try to appreciate what is local, what is wisdom of a location, and also trying to revive what was there. So these are the kind of ideas we thought would be useful in a site like this. So that's why it's not about the buildings, it's not about the object, but it's more about the process. So this is what it is, built by the villagers. So we employed villagers, they made it. These are from the pottery villages, so you can see the kind of interesting pottery that they make. And so what we again did also is we created a community initiative through which we do craft diversification workshops. We've created savings group with ladies who actually save money every week. So these savings group now have quite enough money to loan themselves for their own betterment of their own environment. We've also done mapping. The maps that I showed you are actually made by the villagers themselves. So these are also certain things that we worked with. So these are some of the $1,500 home projects which are done 1 hour away from our site by Hasibul Kubir, another architect who's working there in a place called Chinaida. And we used his idea to also help our villagers to build something of their own. And what you'll see interestingly is that while we are building mud houses, the villagers are not interested in living in mud houses anymore. They're more interested in brick houses. The reason is that they want to move up in the social chain. And living in a mud house for them is not socially acceptable anymore. When you are living in a brick house, you can marry your daughter better, you can get a better wife for your son, or you're climbing the social ladder in a way. So this is their aspiration. They want brick houses. And in a way, I think we also respected that idea that, okay, if you want it, then that's what you should get. You cannot push somebody in the name of architecture. We cannot push someone a material which they don't want or they don't want to live in anymore. So how to bring that balance? That's also something we're working on at the moment. So this is project in Chinaida. And that's also something I worked on while I was teaching at GSD. And this was my project for the studio, $2,000 home project, where in a village, $2,000 is actually 3 cows and a goat. And that's a lot of money, actually. So my studio from Harvard came to Chinaida, and they saw these houses, met with the clients, did this, tried to understand the material that are available there. So they made all these hands-on workshop, meeting the clients, trying to answer. So we had 5 different clients. So they talked to the clients to understand their aspiration and to build around it. So basically the process we called is co-creation. And through co-creation, you do not, you as an architect, you basically take a back seat or become a partner in a way with the people, so that you both together, their aspiration and your understanding and your knowledge, both together combined, creates an architecture. So basically that's what the students were working on, the idea of co-creation. And so they listened to the clients with a very respectful manner. And then that's what they tried to manifest through their designs. with the budget of $2,000. So they really had to work hard to find that right balance between aspiration and also the budget that they had available to them. So these are some of the projects that the studio did. And the Harvard GSD also made a book out of this whole studio that we did, $2,000 home, co-creating in the Bengal Delta. I think I will finish it here. I think that was quite a long one, but I hope you all enjoyed, and thank you so much.
From the top down. So the top down process, it started probably like 2 centuries or 3 centuries ago with the industrial economy when it started flourishing. And you needed to create these urbanized settlements, and you needed quick construction. We needed standardization of all different construction processes. And for that reason, the symbol of growth and progress has become synonymous to what we have in the cities, let's say, with brick, with concrete, things like that. So so that's where we need to start working, that how you can change the value system and bring it to a point where we can start. And if we want to start, we have to start from the city and go down.
Okay, so I mean, what struck me also was that there was a, tell me if I'm completely wrong, what struck me was also that, your students and the villagers actually come from 2 very different worlds. Mm-hmm. And, the representation of the village, in plan sections, elevations, in your, very, very smart, impressive drawings, is not part of either the villagers' vocabulary or the design process. So how were you able to communicate, and how were they able to communicate the design process? Or was there any communication that required a third way of, meeting point where the drawings and the conversations became one?
Yeah, so we, once the students were going through let's say the first preliminary or the second preliminary, we took it back to the students, to the villagers. We made prints and showed them like how this is what they're coming up with. And quite often the brick houses were the ones that were becoming much more popular than the ones that were trying out mud or different designs. So, the distinction that the students got, which were much more about trying the new approach to houses, like, let's say, creating stacks. One project I particularly remember, which I haven't shown, is that he tried to create shelves with the facade and using the same material, but then he tried to keep it as open as possible so that there is enough airflow and everything. So what happens is that they constantly require privacy. So privacy is an issue. So I think, the studio work and what is in reality and what people actually want quite often doesn't really match. So definitely it needs a lot of conversation, during the design phase. And once you've done the design, that's not the end of it. So once you go into construction and implementation, that's again another process. So that process is also something which has not yet been done with this project here. Now we plan to build it, actually. We plan to build at least 5 of these houses. And so when we go through that process, probably that will be again another. So I think there are 2 aspects to it. One is the design process, and then second is the implementation process. And that's where also you need a lot of investment in terms of knowledge and knowledge sharing.
And of course, I mean, these are not 2 separate, they're very much intertwined.
Absolutely,
together.
Yeah.
That, and change in one will certainly influence change in another. Is your disappointment as a city architect with the reluctance of the village folk in using mud and going for brick placed in some sort of a hope that we can still refine them, or is it the disappointment is echoed in how they would view us as people who actually are kind of in a way asking them to do something, coming from cities, living in such an environment and then asking them not to do what we are doing.
Exactly.
I mean, is the disappointment sort of lack of...
It's not disappointment. I would say it's kind of asking the question why it is so. I mean, we are definitely not happy living in an apartment in the city, which is almost like a pigeon's living like a pigeon, but where they are free and living in the land. And it's, for me, it's an absolute luxury to be there, to live in that situation. But for them, it's a poor man's living. So I think there is some sort of a disconnect that has happened the way we have projected what is progress, what is growth, what is valuable and what is not. So we need to change the value system. And if you want to address the values, it has to start from the city. It has to start from where these projections are going down into the villages. So it needs to change in the urban level. We need to, if you want to talk about mud, you need to bring mud to the city first and show that this is a material which you can celebrate, with which you can live with. And then if that becomes synonymous to growth and progress, then definitely it will follow down. We don't have to go and tell them.
So in a way, we still live in hope that they will emulate what we do. So
absolutely.
Not the other way around.
It's quite often not the other way around. No.
It's not. I mean, that is interesting. What was the response of the your students who come from yet another world, very distant geographically, culturally, to the site that they were working in? Of course, linguistically, culturally, they were almost twice removed. And what was the response of the village people to the installation that was in another world? I mean, how were the two responses?
Yeah. So the students' reactions, definitely, you can imagine, coming to from one of the highest paid schools to a place where it's one of the probably the most I would say low income or no income population of the world, is quite unique in a way, this connection. And so what I think they understood is how minimal you require to live. It's not about what you have or not have, but how really minimal you can live with, and how you can actually source from whatever you have around you to make a living. And that's basically is, I think, one of the major learning experience for them. And
which you describe as luxury, ironically.
Yeah, absolutely. And also how happy people are with that little that they have, actually. Yeah. So I think, all these values needs to really go through an overhauling. We need to reevaluate everything. And I think this pandemic has given us that opportunity where we can really, reevaluate all our ways of lives and to come to a position where we need to address this idea of our existential crisis.
Did you get a sense that the students, were happy to find that, okay, these kind of models exist, good for the world, as long as I don't have to do it? Did you find, or do you find that some of this learning will go to their studio and it's altered their...
I feel that students nowadays, especially in the 21st century architects, are far more concerned about their future than we were, let's say, 30 years ago. So they are far more concerned. They are much more informed. They know what are the problems. They want to address that. And I must say that it's an option studio. And I was suggesting a $2,000 home in a village of Bangladesh, but it was one of the most popular studios in GST at that time in 2017, which means that there is an enormous interest among students to come and learn about these things.
Totally. I mean, I'm totally agree with you. And I think South Asia is the best undergraduate degree in architecture that any student in any part of the world can have, because we expose them to complexities of society, of diversity, of inclusivity, which I think the so-called first world doesn't have that much.
Exactly.
So I think that calls for really celebrating what we can offer the world in terms of education. But also the other way around, did the villagers see your installation? What was their reaction? Or did they understand it, or they were puzzled by it? What do you
No,
think?
they're very indifferent about these things. Yeah,
Yes.
no, I mean, we've shown them the images of the students' works. They were very happy to see what beautifully can be done. And we said, this is exactly what you can have with the money that you are planning on making a house. So it could be, what we were trying to address is that they will go for brick. I have no problem with building with brick in a setting like as Kubir has done, let's say in Jinaida. But the problem is they lack the knowledge of building with brick. The amount of knowledge that they have gained through building with mud do not exist in the same capacity in building with brick. So when they make a building with brick, it's always some sort of a shabby, one layer building where it's completely damp. They do not know how the processes are. So they need to learn those. So if you want to make a building with brick, go ahead, make it. But then you need to also have that knowledge. But they do not know there's something called architect that exists in this world who has the knowledge, but sitting there in the cities and not really ready to share their knowledge with the people who really need it.
So in a way, it emphasizes the point again of the process, which also some of it may have got lost in translation between the villagers and the students. I mean, like the students don't know how to build in mud, but can they learn it in plan sections, elevations?
Yes,
I don't know whether the wisdom transfer can happen.
Yeah. That's also important. Yeah, I mean, they try to understand the material. They work with it for a week, working, but 1 week's knowledge is not good enough. They built a few things with mud, kind of a structure, and they understood that it's not a simple material to work with. But then again, that's not good enough. But it's a studio, we're all bound by time anyway. So.
And one last question, and then we'll go to Rafiq. When you use the sun-dried bricks, what are the levels of its origins do you kind of retain as far as its material mud is concerned? I mean, do you have a kind of a, as you say, the pond and mound approach that you will get the bricks from a certain location and then you will use it? Or is it? I mean, is it that you source it?
We sourced it from around the area. So we had a few brick kilns around that area. So we talked to them, and then we said that we just want the sun-dried mud bricks. So they have their model, these stencils with which they make the bricks and everything, and dry it in the open ground. Very basic, primitive system. And so we said that, before you put it in the kiln, we just want that brick. So they gave it to us and we bought it at a cheaper price than we would get otherwise. And that's what we used. What we were more concentrating on was the mud mortar and the mud plaster. The plaster should not come out, and it needs to also breathe as a material. So we used lime in the process and some other like rice husk and all these other ingredients that generally you see being used in the villages also. So we used all of those materials.
And the roof,
the
saw
thatching.
But the later project, the $2,000 project, you used tin roof, asbestos? Or?
Yeah, those are basically corrugated sheet roofing. That's what you see in the villages nowadays. You don't see thatch roof anymore.
And
it's
a
kind of a luxury
in the rainy season.
Oh yeah,
but it's havoc.
But we have a nostalgia about rain hitting the tin roof at times. Yes, yeah, it's also quite nice.
Too, I mean, where it rains awfully lot. And and is there a kind of a brick drying season? I mean, it must rain hell of a lot. And how do brick kilns function for sun-dried bricks? Because where do they dry?
Yeah, so we are a subtropical climate. So we have, let's say, half a year of rain and humidity, and then half a year we do have a dry season. So the dry season is the time when you see all the brick kilns and all the production of bricks happening. Even our constructions are very much geared towards the dry season. So we have the dry season is more about construction and building and all that. And during the monsoon season, especially, you don't see that much of activity, except for obviously construction sites are on, but otherwise you don't see bricks being built. But we have automated brick industries nowadays, where the climate doesn't really matter anymore. So you can build it anytime.
Those are baked bricks. They're not sun-dried bricks, because you need the sun for sun drying.
Absolutely,
I would hope so.
Yeah, no. So they have a different system of drying nowadays with these automated brick factories.
Like an oven, and you just dry it. And...
Professor Vibhuti, maybe we can go to Architect Rafiq Azam.
Yes,
time remaining.
Thank you for the prompt. Yes, thank you, Marina. We'll come back and have a chat later also together if we have time. Rafiq, your turn, because you are going to show us a completely different scenario of mud and other stories. You're on mute. You're still on mute.
Unmute,
and you're
please.
saying lots and we're missing all of
unmute.
it. That is what is worrying me. Okay. You're still on mute.
Yes.
Sorry, my apology. Actually, I was unable to organize much of things, so I'm not sharing any slides today. But I think what Marina is showing, I think good enough to understand all about mud is.
So you're not going to show us the PPT that you were promised. So we'll have to call you again.
Yeah, you know, I'm not a person extensively working with mud.
No, never mind, because you have.
Yeah, I have a little story, which is.
Yes, tell us about Ladakh and what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking about the Bhutan project, the Bangladesh High Commission. We went there and we had a bit of research over there, and said they have a tradition. We cannot normally the Bhutanese, they don't allow to build something different from Bhutanese architecture style. But for the embassy issue, they allowed us to do whatever you feel like to do, because they're inviting other countries to establish their, the missions over there. But it was us, you know, we said, no, we want to follow your tradition, your culture, your architectural language. We don't want to build something like alien over there. And then it came up how we are going to adopt their, culture and tradition and architectural language. That's the reason we did a bit of research over there. And interestingly, the mud is also, though it is a very traditional, like hundreds of years of old tradition of Bhutanese architectural material, but unfortunately, they're also forgetting day by day. It's very hard to get the labor over there, the people who have knowledge of constructing mud architecture over there. So it was very frustrating. And the final frustration came up after all the research, we developed, because I was working with Kerry Hill, in project in Chittagong. That's why I was meeting him on and off. And he did one wonderful project over there, resort over there. Aman Koras, he did 7 Aman Koras, basically made of rammed earth. And we learned from him also. But final frustration came over when our government, after submitting all the documents, including design, they said everything is fine except the mud architecture, the rammed earth architecture. So that was my end of journey with mud. So I came back to Square, the same Square I was working with. Unfortunately.
So why did they, say that at the end of the journey rather than the beginning of the journey? Was they kind of open to? How did you persuade them to at least?
I tell you, this is not suddenly happened. This is historically happened. This is categorically and systematically this was destroyed. That's the story. That I understand. My understanding. That's the story. My understanding about the mud architecture. And to me, I love really landscape. Most of my project is now based on landscape, and I love landscape, and I love water. Most of my project, my city design now happening in the cities, mostly all part of Dhaka, I really deal with water much and landscape. So I found that when we walk on the earth, is below is having the water. On earth, below water, and you see the water is actually below the earth. So it's the best material when earth and water comes together and combine together, intertwine together, it becomes mud, as I understand. So this mud is the best material in terms of ecology, in terms of philosophy, in terms of health, in economy also, in every sense. But think it's international politics, basically. It was wiped out, this material, very carefully. See the diamond, if you consider diamond as a material, it has no value. It's useless, it's valueless material, but promoted in a way, it has become the most costliest material on earth. This is all fake and promoted. So people who are oriented and capitalist or look for money, they can manage, they can promote things as they wish. Actually, Marina was just pointing out a little bit of industrial revolution, what actually made it happen. This wiping out this indigenous interesting material. Consider, yesterday I was talking about, consider the human body, humanity. A human body is in one sense, if you want to promote in a way that is very fragile, very vulnerable, very weak, you can't do so many things as a person. You can't fly, you can't jump from the top, so you can't do many things, so you can promote it as a very weak entity. So you need lot of medicine. You need lot of medicine. That's why you are accumulating huge amount of medicine, and that has been proved very clearly in the pandemic situation. It is indeed not a very big problem. This COVID situation is a respiratory problem issue, and you see the kids, younger generation, they're almost like they don't understand what is happening. They don't need to fight with these things. Children are basically completely unaware there is a respiratory issue is happening all over the world because their immunity. So immune issue is so important, but on medicine we are depending now. So the aged problem has a serious problem. It is immune issue and respiratory issue, and we are all, because the whole world health is collapsed basically, and that has been because of business that has been promoted that you have to depend on medicine. This is how mud has been.
So you think mud is a poor man's material and a fragile material only because how it's branded, rather than
branding. That's why if you see, there are a lot of documents if you go through, even the movie like Pandemic says scientists were crying last year, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years back, even 2 years back, 2019 also, they were literally crying, in the movie also, saying, please give us some fund. And they're moving out from USA and North America, going to the Mexico to do the research that this respiratory issue needs to be overcome. And this is coming as a pandemic. It's coming actually. They foresee it very clearly when they didn't know. But the fund has been withdrawn, intentionally withdrawn and invested in a business purpose only. So these are happening intentionally. Mud never has been paid any money to do the research and develop it as a sustainable material. I'm not telling that you have to build a Manhattan building like 100-story building with the mud. Now, I'm not that romantic actually, but you can make a lot of buildings at low stories, like Jenne, the mosque are happening like almost like 6-story, 5-story mosques. It's still 100 years is old happening. So this has been intentionally done. Like another point is, if you think how it's happened, They said one stage capitalism says the modernism is no more good. They have challenged themselves, and the postmodernism came to challenge the modernism. It's a question face to face. Others, postmodernism has no value, in fact, in the history of world. Why they did it actually? They created something, and then they created globalization. In a way that global economy will be, the parity will come. They will sharing the good things together, as if they will be sharing, they will be globalizing the love and respect and flowers and whatnot. But end of the day, we have seen they have globalized armament, they have globalized war, they have globalized the hatred and disrespect and distrust simply. This is
So
how
basically, I mean,
their
yeah.
ideas, and they have killed the ecology, and then now coming and asking money to rate you. You are a green architecture. You're
So
doing green.
is there any hope? I mean, is there any hope, or should we just wait for the next economic model to?
I think there is a hope. I don't want to go far away. Look at Bangladesh architecture. Even Bangladeshi architect, young architects like Marina Tabassum, also other architects also, here, young architects, they're working. Look at their work. They are simultaneously very aware of the contemporary issues, the world politics, the world architecture, world economics. Simultaneously, they are very looking into their own land, their water, the delta, the climatology, all the issues, coming up together, and our architecture is shaping up much better way rather than, other areas, not historically. Historically, our architecture.
But that's how much, I mean, that's a very small percentage of the population, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's true. But everything starts from a small population. Nothing starts from so generously or so hugely to change the world, change the things. And first thing, like Jalaluddin Rumi says, I thought today I will change the world, and I was thinking changing the world, but when I became wise, I thought, no, change myself first, So this is what we need to change ourselves first, and then we talk about we'll change the world. So I think that process has been started, and now we need to promote it rather than promoting the diamond or something like that. We promote good architecture, good environment. So change, a little bit of change, and improve the life of the human being.
So what are the problems? What are the problems with mud, apart from the fact that there is a resistance, with in terms of identity, cultural identity, social identity, status issue, how it's perceived. What are the practical problems of using mud in an urban situation, according to you?
No, since mud, look at the state of mud. It's almost like 2,000 years back, or like 100 years back, the state of mud, what it was, almost like is similar nowadays. No research has been done to improve it, with some sort of ingredient, maybe natural or maybe semi-natural.
Which is there in our, and in the local wisdom, that all that exists, like Marina
Professor
was saying.
Vibhuti, there is a question from Nikita Pandey to the panel. You say that we need marketing to normalize mud as a material, but that has usually led to standardization of the material. Do you think mud should be standardized in the first place? This is from Nikita
this question
Pandey. To all of you, in general, for discussion, up for discussion.
Right. After the discussion,
I don't have much to say because I'm not a mud person, in fact.
No.
But definitely, standardization is a trick for the business. Absolutely, because local standards should be different. The local people, the indigenous knowledge. But additionally, the technology or the research will give you some tips to make it more sustainable, more resilient also. Of course, mud is in one sense, one-story building, mud is more sustainable, more resistant material, resilient material. But if you go for like 3, 4, 5-story mud, what needs to be done? That can be a research route. We can talk about it.
So they
These
can
are
be
not
hybrid,
institutionalized.
hybrid buildings which use, non-structural elements in mud, and then your interior can be mud, and you can also don't have to resist steel, as Professor Lari said in the morning session. But I mean, why, I mean, one is of course the carbon footing, but do you think this is going to have any traction in the urban scenarios? Or should we go to the questions? Is it going to take root in, for example, will you be using more of mud in your next project, to put it simply?
Yes, why not? Why not?
Question to me?
In your city?
It depends. It depends. See, everything has limitations. Like human being, you can't just think, "Well, I will fly tomorrow." I can fly, then I do research and develop the plane or something to fly. So mud is not at the state that you can use it ready mud to use anything for. You have to develop something. But of course, if it is a position, it's not only a material problem, it's a social problem also. It's not only international politics also, it's a social, local politics and social problem also. All together, it has a problem. So you have to overcome one after another to create something very very substantial. So like Marina is working in a village, even village, they have a problem with the mud. So, this is a matter of, this is a result of globalization, because now they have the mobile phone. They can see the world is changing, something, there are very lucrative things all over the world, and nobody is talking about mud. Mud is a symbol of poor people's, symbolize is semiology of a symbol, semiology of a poor thing. So these are a lot of barriers also there that we need to overcome. But I don't think that we need to die for that we need to do only thing mud. We need to be flexible, and we need to take it as whenever we need to do something, we need to use it properly. The appropriateness is very important, rather than desperately we need to use mud. That's my point.
Professor Amrita, you raised your hand. You have a question?
No, not really a question, but I thought that, that earlier conversation when you got interrupted was a very good direction, that we were finding some sort of connections where we were looking at what holds us back. And both the speakers have talked about it in the sense of, sort of a very linear sort of process of unidirectional process of translating knowledge, right? So from city to the village is one process, and from architects to, the lay people is one process. Both processes are pretty linear. Maybe one can see if there is a space for, some other processes integrated within this, or is this going to be possible with a material like mud, which has, come from the earth, but now we are looking at it from somewhere else and putting it back into the earth. So just some thoughts on that, I thought.
So I think that's a very interesting question, because Rafiq, you time and again, and to some extent also, we see this transfer of wisdom and knowledge happening in both cases. But you said we are not advanced, the science is not advanced enough to deal with mud.
I think that's
well, I think there hasn't been a lot of research. I mean, I do not know much of research that has happened.
Does the
wisdom, that's also important, yeah.
So what happens when you translate traditional wisdom in terms of modern scientific processes? You lose a whole layer of knowledge of how to do it, and
it's not necessary that you need to completely forego that, when they can exist in the same way as traditional knowledge is already there. We need to preserve that. We need to promote that also. But when you talk about a city, we already have created these two different contexts. One is village and one is urban. So when you build something in the urban location, and if you're talking about mud as a material coming to the urbanity and making a place for itself, like let's say Portland cement has done, or let's say even brick has done. So if you wanted to compete with such a material or such material that exists, then there has to be some sort of research where you can promote material which are off the land, which actually closes the circle where you bring it out of the ground, earth, and then you put it back to the earth. When you talk about Portland cement, let's say, it's not that. It's a material that is processed and created in a way that it creates an anthropogenic cycle which doesn't go back into the earth, so it doesn't sink back. So we need to create materials which sinks back, and that's why we need to address this issue of existential crisis, that we as human beings are in crisis. So you need to create new materials which addresses these issues.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is that one also will create the science for and against that material. Now we've created a science of sustainability that is pro-mud, anti-concrete. And what is happening with that is that the traditional wisdom, I mean, to use a cliche, there is a difference between H2O and water. Water in its cultural context, what it means, its origin, how it flows, what sources of water. And H2O is a completely different, representation of water. So although H2O is a standardized way of, looking at what we drink, it is not necessarily gives us any information how to deal with it. And similarly, I mean, would then mud have to go through this so that it becomes something that comes out of a can? I mean, this is going back to the earlier conversation, but like what we've done to water, we bottled it. And, and in order to, and water is available everywhere, so is mud. So how do you kind of make it, consumable? Is to kind of mechanize it, bottle it, can it, standardize it, explain it in terms of ingredients, and what do you lose in that process is something that that would be interesting to watch, and whether those processes can be, I don't know, included in that new knowledge system. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, well. Yeah, there are a lot of ifs and buts, definitely. But at the same time, the process can also be questioned and proved, actually. In the fact that you need to, you're taking something out of the earth. When you go through the process is also something where you need to make sure that you're not creating any byproducts, which is then again another kind of waste that the earth is unable to handle. So I think this entire process, and then also after you use it, how you put it back into the earth and how you close that cycle is important. So as I said, that not much research has been done yet, that where you can actually take mud and use it as a material of in an urban setting, other than being a nostalgia or someone's own personal interest in that.
So that dichotomy is very interesting to say. On the one hand, not enough research has been done. On the other hand, say, this is a 2,000-year-old wisdom we are working with. Not that 2,000-year-old wisdom has no research or experiential grounding. At the risk of, ignoring other people around, I must pay attention to the questions. Nikita Pandey asks, you say that we need marketing to normalize mud as a material, but that has usually led to standardization of material. Do you think mud should be standardized in the first place? This is a topical question because we've just spoken about that. Do you want to add something to that, both of you?
No, I mean, I'm kind of against standardization in a way. It doesn't need to be standardized. Diversity is important. It's not always about conformity. It's also about diversity. So, depending on mud is, we just in generalizing mud, but mud has many different minerals, many different components in it. So you cannot just standardize even if you want to.
Yeah, I think geology says mud is more complicated than human being actually. So it cannot be standardized. But no, I want to point another thing, like Like the mud construction in our country, as Marina was showing, we are doing it in the city, in Dhaka also now, it is in the master planning. The cut and fill or, dug it out and mount, creating the mount actually. So this is how the houses happened earlier. Think everybody is digging out mud like brick was happening. Why you are stopping brick nowadays, Bangladesh? Two reasons. One is you are digging up too much and taking out the earth, and then you are burning it. If not, it's gas is creating a lot of carbon dioxide. That's a big problem. So digging out, taking out mud also creating problems. So only ponds coming up in the urban city because density is very important. Look at Dhaka as an urban city. The population general, it is 45,000 per square kilometer. In many, probably in Canada, if you look at 4 people in whole country, 4 people per square kilometer, where in Bangladesh it is more than 2,000, in Dhaka it's more than 6,000, 45,000. In some places we are working 150,000 people per square kilometer are staying. So can you imagine how much development is happening for every family having their own house and digging up earth and making house? There's no political problem. There's no social problem. Considering if there's no social problem, no political problem, no other issues, research has been done properly. So they can use mud sort of, but what will happen to the ground? So that is also another big problem in urban context.
Exactly, yes. It is.
So these are all issues that they are need to consider in urban.
And it can go the other way. If you start using mud too much, you're eating up the agricultural land. Where you're going to
agricultural land. That's happened in Bangladesh also. That's why government is stopping digging up the earth, because we are losing agricultural land. A small country, big people. And in one monsoon season, 2/3 of the country is going underwater. So we don't need more, dug up thing and more water containment only. We need also land, which is, the lower land taking water and the water gone, and the crops are coming up 4 times, 3 times, 5 times crops coming up. So that's also important. Yeah.
There's a question from Vaiza Rafiq Salva. If the use of mud was not a social issue, to what extent could we realistically use mud in our urban environment? Could this use actually be enough to push ourselves towards sustainability?
No, that just I talked about, we cannot make it like so much hugely.
Okay, Srijani is asking, it's interesting to see that our inhibitions for not using mud in urban areas is not the technical or structural advancement, but more because of the social stigma. Yes, and connecting back to today morning, architect Yasmin Lari was emphasizing the need for proof. Okay, so Chitra Vishwanath, if you're here, do you want to ask the question directly, or I can read out?
I think she's here, if she can come in.
Well, I don't think I'm asking a question. I'm just trying to comment, because what happens is that we tend to see mud as just one hue. It isn't. The kind of mud you would get in North India, or at least in East, like Bangladesh and Bengal and others, is higher clay, so it needs to be fired. And that's how it's used. But if you even read Vitruvius and you see how he talked about to use bricks, and he said use bricks at the lower level up to about 4 courses, and under the roof up 4 courses. The rest of them need not be fired bricks. But the way we tend to use is that we can just use fired brick right away. It is not needed. It's not needed everywhere. Secondly, I again keep on coming back to the fact that though yes, cement is added, it still is a reusable material. Not that every material has to go back to the soil. Like William McDonough said in Cradle to Cradle, is that some of it is agriculture, some of it is industrial reuse. And we in Bangalore have been reusing mud blocks. If you decide on the kind of mortar you use, you can remove it completely and reuse it, or crush it and reuse. So I think we should look at CSEBs as a bridge building material, because we don't want to use more of firing of the clay. And obviously, it's places like in South India, the soil has less clay and it's ideal to use earth blocks. And there are a huge number of entrepreneurs who are making this. So this is more of a comment and adding to the whole debate, not really a question. I'm sorry if it's not a question. Yeah.
No. That's totally, I mean, a valuable addition to the conversation, and also coming from Chitra is always valuable. So Oendriza Reza is, let me see if it's a question or a comment. As far as I understand, bricks are derivation of mud blocks, which could be used to make a structure more durable, less maintenances are required and increases longevity. So my question is that, to what extent is it really different in using bricks and mud for construction, and how could it affect the ecosystem if we advocate raw mud structures? Yeah, so we've just talked about the agricultural land and how actually overdoing anything is dangerous, overdoing, goodness is dangerous. So I think we've talked about how, there is already an issue with agricultural land in Bangladesh, which is being addressed. And also the ponds, how much water holding instruments do you need in a place where it rains so much? I mean, Himanshu has his hand raised. Would you like to ask the question, Himanshu?
Sure. Thanks, Vibhuti. My question is actually to Marina here, because she was talking about existential crisis, and in that notion of existential crisis, we need to innovate newer materials. But and I'm trying to tie what Rafiq also mentioned about the necessity of digging up earth. So in that scenario, what about the existential crisis of the structure itself? And because the material that we are talking about, and the conclave is based on this particular material, is facing that kind of existential crisis. But then this material, when applied and when it gets shaped and molded into a particular structure or a particular artifact, the existence is prevailing. We can see it exists, but over a period of time, a decade or 2 decades later, the existence just vanishes, disappears. So if we are looking into this particular material and looking into the future of it, what will be the existential crisis for the structure? Marina, if you can throw some light on this.
Well, that's the problem with us architects. We think our buildings should last 100 years or more. It's not necessary to do that. Buildings, depending, I think there are two kinds of buildings that were built from the very beginning of architecture. There were building of impermanence. Generally, what people built for themselves to live in, to dwell in, was always impermanent in nature. So it was never about permanence. The only thing that were permanent or were seeking permanence was actually architecture of power, and architecture that could be political power, it could be religious power, it could be cultural power. So you see throughout the history of architecture, even in our own region, you'll see that in most cases, the mausoleums, the palaces, all these institutions were built for permanence, to be there for hundreds of years. But if you look at human habitats, it's always about change. It was always evolving through different processes. So, if you're talking about dwellings, then I do not think it's necessary to think that it should last 100 years. That's what my take is about. And that's the reason why we can look into different materials and also include in our own mentality as architects that we should be ready to have these changes.
So then that would lead to a duel between authenticity and facticity. where the authenticity is talking about the material itself, and the facticity will talk about the existence of the structure with respect to that? Or you think there would be a balance? Can
There
we
should be
achieve
a
a balance
balance.
between the
Yeah,
two?
absolutely. It's always about balance. That's what we architects do. We seek balance.
So can I add?
Okay.
Sure,
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 sure.
Rafiq.
I think you see, it's like really it's a mostly social issue, because like a caste system, and also it's like a feudalist approach, you know, because any person in the village they have seen, probably a person was staying in mud house and gradually become rich, and then he built a house which is a brick or plaster or some classical language over there, you know, and it seems like he's upper caste, you know, he's going up and up, and he wants to see his life like that, you know, and then it's an approach of feudal sort of approach. And Jamindar house, you know, is never made of mud, you know. You see, look at the British houses, British time or even Mughal time, big houses are, so it looks like it's an upper caste, and you have to reach that is a social issue, a big social problem. And this is how they think, like you need to build something to last longer and longer, that generations after generation that you remembering you as your existence. So that's it should work like where it is, you know. I mean, if you are really managing the whole world, probably you can think of something for the people, the community, to build something which will last as long as possible based on the technology, time and technology. But your own house, a simple village house, why it needs to last like 100 years? You know, you die, your children will build another one simply using the same technology or some other technology new available at the time.
So I think we are moving towards, I think we are moving towards, you know, the immaterial world, which and the invisible one as something that, but you know, classical traditions have always been built on continuity and permanence. So what is the shift that needs to happen to, you know, to have that thread with our past and with our origin is something we can reflect on. We have sadly come to the end of this interesting conversation, and thank you so much for the generosity and the patience with which you shared your ideas and thoughts. And this is a beginning of, I think, continuing conversations that will happen. Thank you both so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
For this lively session. Now I am inviting Associate Professor Aruna Bharadwaj for thank you notes.
Thank you. I would like to say today, as we come to the end of this day of explorations of urban origins, IPAC 2021-2022 Mud Futures, global multi-location, multi-host conclave on the futures of mud in architecture, one realizes how much there is to know, to learn, to think, and to do in this field. Today has been all about revisiting our so-called subscribed beliefs and popular perceptions. Very much when we have talked about we are in the urban space, we look forward to the urban space, but it's the origins where we need to start from. And our co-hosts at BRAC University have been exceptional. So first and foremost, I would like to thank the Honorable Minister Azizuzzaman Noor, Member of Parliament Government of the People's Republic Bangladesh, for his inaugural talk, where he rightly raised the call to back to earth, return to the land through Tagore's poetry. And as he said, not as an alarmist, but as a realist, he emphasized the need for adaptation that created a better life for the next generation. He also talked about unprecedented issues, and which in our last discussion right now with architect Marina, architect Rafiq, and Professor Vibhuti, we were talking about and how it is not so easy when one says mass construction in mud. So thank you, sir. Enlarging on these ideas, architect Yasmin Lahiri literally showed how to walk the talk, or as I may say, if I may say, tread lightly, barefoot. So we thank her for showing that to engage with the materials such as mud, lime, and bamboo is a challenge that we architects need to take up, as this area suffers from a design deficit, and we do need to somewhere embrace the role of activist and embrace our own inner conscious and say, yes, we can do it. She in fact showed 1,000 different ways to use mud as an ingredient, and actually helped in dissipating popular beliefs that it is not a pakka material. So thank you, Architect Lahiri, for reinterpreting this tag, Star Architects. It was truly inspiring. I will also like to thank Architect Jalal Ahmed for sharing his successful projects done with mud. And this showcased in a very honest way the many challenges that he faced and the learnings also from it. So adaptations in mud to contemporary living. So this quality of, one more point that he raised and which has been a part of our discussions today, is that mud or earth is not same everywhere, and this is being re-emphasized again and again, and that one needs, it has its contextuality, and hence I think it is the onus is on us architects to be sensitive to the type and quality of mud, and hence I think there is more need for rigor. So through his works, we take inspiration. Thank you, Architect Jalal Ahmed. The present the present discussion that we were having, and Architect Marina Tabassum, thank you for your presentation first and foremost, and I think the focus on community involvement and bringing forth youth, that is a very poignant idea, and which is a key idea, in fact, from what Architect Yasmin Lahiri was also talking about, that we need to be inspiring in our teaching, and we need to include them in the design process, and that mud needs to, in everybody's mind, there has to be probably ways of breaking away from this notion of the poor man's material. So also, I think the point that the need for research in this area is very, very important, which, as Architect Rafiq Azam also laid emphasis on. And in fact, we must thank him, because he, coming from exceptional practice, the large number of projects that he's done, and he came in with words of wisdom and a caution that says we do need to be, use mud appropriately, and let's not get desperate here. So, small country, big people. For Bangladesh, for a country like India, we might say we are bigger country, but we are still bigger people. So we face the same issues given the densities. So there is thank you, Architect Rafiq Azam. I will also like to thank Professor Dr. Vibhuti Sachdev for raising pertinent issues and being very, very forthright and asking such questions which were hard-hitting. Points such as, how if we try, it's very easy to talk about traditional knowledge, but when we translate traditional knowledge, do the qualities, I mean, there are very few successful examples that we are able to take into, say, an urban contemporary. So these are things that one needs to look at. And also, one very important point is that, do we need to question a 2,000-year-old wisdom? And so thank you, Professor Vibhuti. I would would also like to thank Professor Fawad Malik for his support and encouragement for the IPAC 2021-2022 Mud Futures Conclave, as they are our co-hosts. And I will also thank Professor Zainab Farooqi for being our co-host here, and for being instrumental in bringing such a lineup of eminent people and in this field of what we are trying to do, constructing with mud, engaging with it, and mudifying ourselves. So and also thank you, Professor Zainab, for being such a lovely co-chair for today. To Professor Amrita Madan and Himanshu Sangani, Associate Dean at Sushant University School of Art and Architecture, our conclave directors. Thank you for supporting, for at the time working persistently all through this and putting things together. So thanks a lot. Srijani Hazara, Assistant Professor at Sushant University School of Art and Architecture, as the convener. Thank you. You have been great, fabulous. And to the whole team, I will not be naming everybody, to the whole team working at the back end from both BRAC University and Sushant University, I would say thanks a lot. And we need to we are gearing up for tomorrow. So thank you, and looking forward to tomorrow. For tomorrow, this is the schedule. We will be connecting at IST 9:30, and the schedule is raised. So there's an introduction by Professor Fawad Hassan Malik, and also by, and then there is a talk by architect Khandakar Hasibul Kabir from starting IST, I would say again 9:40, so that means 9:10 at Bangladesh time. And Professor Zainab will be sharing her work with data which is related to mud, so cool data. One is really looking forward to that. And there's an audiovisual, and likewise we will have Professor Soumyan Bandyopadhyay talking about culture, society and house from Oman observators, Oman observators, and then we are going to have an interesting discussion on dialogue by Dr. Tanzil Idman Safiq, architect Mona Dr. Pingle, and architect Khandakar Hasibul Kabir. And at the end, we are looking forward to Mohammed Habib Reza from BRAC University, Professor Habib Reza, and Associate Dean Himanshu Sangani for the closing thing. So thank you, and look forward to connecting tomorrow. Thank you, everybody. See you at 9:30 a.m. IST, 10 a.m. UTC.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Aruna ma'am. Thank you so much. So, let's come back again tomorrow and continue this our journey for Mud Futures, Urban Origins. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.